Speaker right now is Kendall Gilfillan, and she's doing departmental honors in philosophy. I'll let her introduce her project.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming to the culmination of my undergraduate research. Today I will be presenting on an Aristotelian conception of dignity, magnanimity, and the happy life of the philosopher. But before I get into the primary content of my actual thesis, I wanted to share with you all a bit about how it is I got involved in this project and how I hope to continue it on in the remainder of my academic career. So I've been heavily involved in the modern day abolitionist movement with respect to sex trafficking and forced labor since I was about 14, doing both nonprofit and governmental activism in the US and the UK. And as such, I've dealt a lot primarily with the concept of dignity. And dignity today is something that is both prescriptive and normative, meaning that it tells us that we ought to recognize an inherent sense of worth in each individual human being. But furthermore, because of that, we have the obligation to treat these human beings in a specific way with a basic level of respect in response to their inherent sense of dignity. So dignity today has come to serve as the basis of global human rights. It's even explicitly mentioned in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I've excerpted here. It says, "Recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world." Now that's a very large and hefty and ambitious task for a single concept. And because of that, I think we're all in agreement that we haven't successfully achieved world peace. And I think that that failure stems from our failure to create a conversation that appeals to a sense of dignity that's going to be able to transcend barriers created by gender and generations and religions and sovereign nations. Because whilst one individual person might be convinced of the inherent worth of dignity for a human being based upon religious ideals, if someone else in a different culture doesn't adhere to that same description, there's not going to be room for cross-cultural progress in the realm of human rights. So I think that if I can offer a historical analysis tracing the conceptual development of the concept of dignity, then perhaps I'll be able to uncover where it is that we're getting this sense of worth. And that, together with my ancient Greek philosophy interest, I decided to concentrate my undergraduate research on an Aristotelian conception of dignity. But that's going to look very different for a multitude of reasons. We didn't get this concept of dignity until after Immanuel Kant, much after Aristotle. And more than this, Aristotle's ethics is going to look really different from what our contemporary considerations in ethical theory are. So Aristotle is what we refer to in philosophy as a virtue ethicist. He has a character-based account, meaning that he maintains the view that if we habitually perform certain virtue-forming habits, then we'll become virtuous people who live a life according to reason, and in turn have a shot at living the happy life that he thinks we ought to strive for. For Aristotle, happiness is the final end for which we do all things. It's the sake for which we pursue all of these moral actions. And this word he refers to as happiness is the Greek word eudaimonia. And I think it's loosely translated happiness, but perhaps more accurately translated as human flourishing. And underneath this, there's all these moral virtues that Aristotle goes to great length to discuss. Moral virtues for him included things like moderation, friendliness, courage, things like that. But today I'm going to be focusing on one moral virtue in particular because I think that it has an elevated status within the ethics. And that is the virtue of magnanimity. And magnanimity comes from the Greek word megalosoukia, which means greatness of soul. But more than this, it functions in Aristotle's ethics as a moral virtue associated with honor, and moreover, how one has a disposition towards the pains and pleasures associated with that honor bestowed upon him. So that's kind of how it's cast as a moral virtue in similar respect to the moral virtues such as temperance and courage and so forth and so on. But I think for two reasons that magnanimity possesses a special status in Aristotle's overall ethics. And those two reasons are, he describes it as the adornment of the virtues. He uses the Greek word kosmos, which can also be translated as beautiful ordering. So it acts as this active principle guiding these moral virtues and arranging them in a way to promote the good life and to promote happiness in an individual's life. So it also requires, prior to being a magnanimous person, that someone already possesses the moral virtues. And insofar as that is true, the magnanimous person is going to be more considered to be more virtuous and more praiseworthy than someone that's merely courageous. And on top of this, there's also an extra intellectual commitment for the magnanimous person, insofar as he has to have an accurate perception of his position in society. Not only does he have to have a belief about where he stands in society, but that has to be true external to what he actually believes it to be. And despite all of that seeming all good, magnanimity has gotten this historically bad rap in the world of philosophy, and that is because Aristotle offers this really puzzling account of the magnanimous person. He describes him as someone that we would all find utterly repulsive. So he says that he disdains most things, he'll give to people, but he hates receiving. He doesn't want to be the object of charity. He likes to be alone, he doesn't like to be around other people, and just someone that we wouldn't want to hang out with on a day-to-day basis. And because of this, people have typically considered the magnanimous person to be someone like the Greek tragic hero Achilles, whose worst nightmare is to be dishonored or to not receive the honor that he deserves. We see the same idea and understanding of the magnanimous person later on with Machiavelli's magnanimous man, who dominates through fortune. But I argue, along with other scholars, that perhaps we're better off understanding the magnanimous person as, say, the person of Socrates or the life of the philosopher. And I think that we can reject the previous view of the magnanimous person being a purely selfish, horrible human being like Achilles for two reasons. And that is because the magnanimous person, Aristotle states, is going to respond in moderation to pleasures and pain. So it's not going to be the case as with figures like Achilles, that you're going to have this unceasing desire to possess honors and get rewards, but rather you're going to have moderation in what you think you deserve. And moreover, while the magnanimous person understands that truthfulness can be found in practical excellence and portraying moral virtues by performing good deeds in society, they're also capable of finding happiness and content in the life of contemplation. And I think that this paints a picture of magnanimity that is both political and philosophical in nature. But I think that this is not an incoherent view to maintain. While some people think it is, I argue that it's not, because Aristotle makes these remarks in Metaphysics 1. He says, but someone who is studying needs none of these external goods relative to, he uses the Greek word pros, that activity. But insofar as he is human and therefore lives together with a number of human beings, he chooses to do the actions expressing virtue. So it need not be the case that if the magnanimous person indeed satisfies the life of the philosopher, that that person is going to live a life of solitude for the rest of his life. Aristotle says it's just relative to that act, relative to the act of contemplating, he's not going to need those external goods. He's not going to need other people present. But insofar as he is still essentially a communal human being, he is going to need society and he is going to be dependent in that way. So despite this positive picture of magnanimity that I've tried to paint in your minds, there's still two problems that arise for Aristotle's conception of magnanimity. Namely, this epistemic condition requiring true understanding of a person's position in society. And second is going to be this paradox that arises from the self-sufficiency of the magnanimous man. So the paradox arises because the thing that the magnanimous person most wants, namely self-sufficiency, requires that he live outside the city. But the thing for which he is best known, namely expressing moral virtue, requires him to live within the city. So he has these two contrasting and conflicting aspirations. This leave him unable to live in the city, but require him to live in the city, and require him to live with people, but leave him unable to live with people. And so how are we supposed to make sense of that? And I argue my thesis that how we do that is through finding an Aristotelian conception of dignity. So, dignity for Aristotle comes from the Greek word synautes, which means proper consideration of others. And he thinks that it's a praiseworthy emotive mean in which a person is not going to think too much of others in society, whereas to do a disservice to himself. And on the other side of that, he's not going to think too little of other people and pay way too much attention to himself that he's not worthy of. And so it's a mean between these two vices for Aristotle. He says in the Eudemian Ethics, a person of dignity differs in some matters but not in others, and only to those who are worthy of regard. So some people have historically conflated these two accounts of dignity and magnanimity because I think it's easy to see that they're related to one another, but it's important, I argue, to keep them distinct from one another because magnanimity is a self-regarding virtue, but dignity, by definition, is an other-regarding virtue. But nevertheless, I think that dignity can help satisfy this requirement of the epistemic condition And I think I can show that without much argument, that if someone is having the proper consideration of others, that they're also going to have a proper consideration of themselves, just in the way that society is organized. And insofar as that is true, I think that dignity fulfills this epistemic condition and helps us make sense of the otherwise puzzling concern that we have. And furthermore, it can help us make sense of the paradox I was talking about a minute ago. So if we rehash that question in another way, we can ask, how is it that the magnanimous person is performing good deeds for those in a society when we've just given this whole account of his character that seems utterly repulsive? And I think that dignity helps us make sense of that. And I think that our intuitions would want us to say that a philanthropic love would have to motivate deeds of that kind. But I think in the case of the magnanimous person, we can make the claim that they are still motivated by an elevated self-love and a love of superiority, which save him from the inferiority that we want to escape. But that doesn't mean that he is plagued by selfishness, because, as we discussed earlier from the epistemic condition, that it is a requirement for a person to be magnanimous that they also be a person of dignity. And through the definition of dignity, we've already precluded the possibility of someone being selfish. So, positioning dignity in Aristotle's overall ethical account, I created this diagram. And to help show all these things that I'm talking about. So, dignity not only is giving rise to this elevated status of magnanimity, but it's also performing all these active roles. And so, through considering those around us, through being people of dignity, we're able to understand those around us and to understand their own place in the world. And insofar as we're doing that, we're getting closer to possessing the truth. And insofar as we're getting closer to possessing the truth, we're getting closer to being able to live the life of happiness that Aristotle thinks that we ought to. And if we are paying the correct amount of attention to others, then we're also intuitively hitting the mark with how we ought to be treating them. And I think that this comes through in Aristotle's conception of wonder. So I'm going to briefly touch upon this. In another one of Aristotle's works, The Parts of Animals, he makes the claim that in everything in nature there is something to wonder about. And then he makes a claim in the Metaphysics that all philosophy begins in wonder. So wonder has this special role, and I think that perhaps painting a picture. So let's conceive of someone coming from the UK to Texas. People from Texas are very different from the people in the UK, and I think that they would get here and they would wonder at what this Texas culture is. And insofar as they're participating in that act of wonder, they're going to have to think about what their relation is to that person. What are these people? What lives are they living? What are they worthy of? What are they not worthy of? And in turn, what am I worthy of? What am I not worthy of in relation to that? And I think through that, we get these concepts of empathy and justice indirectly. And so, while it may not be the case that Aristotle espouses any prescriptive, normative perception and conception of dignity, I think that it nevertheless plays a crucial and active role in Aristotle's overall ethical account, because it gives rise to this very important moral virtue of magnanimity, but it also allows for the possibility of important things in our morality and our moral lives, such as empathy and justice. And moreover, just in nature of properly considering others, it's going to undergird all these moral virtues that we talked about earlier, such as generosity and truthfulness and friendliness and being true. And so I think that not only does it help us make sense of Aristotle's account, but it also provides a glimpse into the historical significance of dignity, and perhaps help us answer that question about how it's come to serve as the foundation of global human rights. And with that, I am happy to take questions.